Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Ariel Weiss, who's an Alexander Technique teacher in Philadelphia, where she's been teaching since 1988. She has a background in movement and dance. She earned her master's degree from Wesleyan University, and in addition to her private practice in Philadelphia, she teaches the Alexander Technique at the Curtis Institute of Music and the University of the Arts, which are both in Philadelphia, and she has served as a guest faculty member for the Philadelphia School for the Alexander Technique, which is a teacher training program in Philadelphia. And Ariel and I are going to talk today about the topic sitting with support and how the Alexander Technique can help that. Ariel, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Robert.
I wonder if you could begin by giving our listeners a very brief description of the Alexander Technique and then say a word or two about what you mean by sitting with support.
I'd be happy to. Alexander Technique is really a study of human coordination in that it looks at how we kind of consider ourselves or think and how that affects how we move and how we function. And the Alexander Technique really takes a look at how when we strain ourselves, we are interfering with our best functioning. And so the technique is a way to kind of optimize our very best functioning, whether that's sitting in a chair or running a marathon or playing a piece of music.
Mm-hmm. And then sitting with support. What do you mean by that phrase?
Well, I'm very interested in people optimizing their best support when they sit because people do a lot of sitting these days, and they do a lot of sitting in a way that really ends up making them very uncomfortable, or even people hurt themselves. At the very least, they kind of interfere again with that best functioning. So most of the time I find my students just assume that sitting is going to make them uncomfortable, and they don't really understand that there are things they can do to sit with more support and be more comfortable and more effective in what they're doing while they sit.
Mm-hmm. And by support, could you just elaborate on that a little bit, that phrase, support?
Well, I think I'm using that term mostly in terms of physical support.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm quite fond of quoting Newton on this one, because Newton tells us that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, if I'm not misquoting that too terribly.
That's right, yeah. Uh-huh. First
And,
law of physics, I think.
oh,
Certainly,
okay.
yeah. Anyway, first law of motion,
My
maybe.
physics studies were a long time ago, but I
Right.
did remember that one.
Yeah.
And, most of the time people think that gravity is just overtaking them and kind of responsible for all that downward pressure. And what they haven't quite really fully recognized is that there's just as much force in response to gravity up through themselves and supporting them up from the chair and up from the floor.
Mm-hmm.
So in my mind, when I talk about sitting with support, it's about kind of balancing out what people are paying attention to and kind of optimizing what's going to make them comfortable and flexible and effective.
Mm-hmm. I can certainly echo the idea that a lot of people who come for Alexander lessons have an idea that gravity is the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And in my view, and I assume in yours as well, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, gravity is really a very helpful force if we know how to organize ourselves to respond properly to it.
Exactly.
And I assume that that's what you're talking about with sitting with support. So what would be the first step that someone who is interested in pursuing this idea of applying the Alexander Technique ideas to sitting, what would be the very first thing they might want to do?
Well, I think the very good starting place would be to kind of debunk the myth that there's such a thing as sitting still. We're not very still as humans. We're really not designed to be very still. And I think people get in a whole lot of trouble when they stiffen themselves and make themselves still when they sit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I start there most often. And I do that in a number of ways. One idea is to ask people to take a break. Sometimes I even ask my students to set the alarm on their computer because I find a computer is a place that people sit for long periods of time without any attention to themselves and where they really start to be very still and stiff.
Mm-hmm.
So
So
this
even
idea,
even just the idea that one should find a right position is actually counterproductive, right?
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if I start talking about finding movement inside of sitting, then I'm hoping to kind of detour that little myth that I'm going to show them the right position, because there is not a right position. There's free movement, there's good balance, but there isn't really a right position.
Mm-hmm. Because there's always movement.
There is always movement.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. And then how would you follow up on that?
Well, from there, I often ask people to kind of open up their sensory mechanism. In other words, when people sit, they're often engaged in a task, and they're often kind of narrowing what information they're letting in. So again, if we look at sitting at a computer as an example, when people are at the computer, they're often so focused in such a narrow way visually on the screen in front of them that they really are not letting in any other information, maybe even through their auditory sense or maybe through their tactile or sense of touch. And certainly, rarely, unfortunately, letting information in through their kinesthetic sense, which is their sense of movement.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to play with my students and kind of talking them through a way to pay attention to that other sensory information. So I'll ask them to feel their feet on the floor. I'll ask them to notice what surfaces of them are contacting the chair that's holding them up. So the back of their legs, the bottom of their pelvis, the back surface of them, and perhaps even their arms might be on the armrests of their chair.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so let's say someone has worked through that. What
Mm-hmm.
what would be the next step?
Well, then I would ask them to kind of notice where their weight is being supported and to kind of really let the chair be a good partner in that. So a lot of times when we sit, people kind of pull down or collapse themselves in a way that puts their weight oftentimes into their low backs, sometimes into their bellies, and even more strangely, up in their shoulders, which is a kind of interesting choice.
Sort of lifting themselves up, that sort of thing?
Yes,
Yeah.
pulling themselves forward.
Pulling themselves up or forward. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
And so we kind of talk through what is a really good use of their design, which would be to support their weight through their hip joints and through the bottom of their pelvis, through their sit bones, right into the chair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's helpful. I don't know whether you have a little skeleton available that you show people, but it can be very useful for people to actually see those little the sits bones that you're talking about. They're little rockers, really, and they're perfectly
Yes,
designed both to support your weight in sitting and to allow for easy movement.
exactly.
And a lot of people, when they sit, tend to sit back on their sacrum more, and so they've kind of lost
Yes,
that support. And of course, that puts a tremendous amount of strain on their back and can lead to all sorts of unpleasant things. So I would say for anyone wanting to work a little bit on their own, even with sitting more easily, it would be pretty useful to take a look at either a skeleton or perhaps a very simple, basic anatomy book, and just see where those sits bones are, and maybe even feel them on yourself. Put your hands under your
Yes.
bottom when you're sitting, and you should be able to feel two little really kind of projections downward from your pelvis, and they are perfectly designed for sitting.
Right. I like to tease people and say they don't call them sitting bones for nothing.
No, they
Yes.
don't. Oh, they don't.
And I
So,
think it's a
yeah.
great idea. And I would even take it a step further, Robert. Not only do I have a skeleton at my studio, but I have one that I actually bring with me when I do demonstrations.
Hmm.
And I sit the skeleton in a chair
Hmm.
and show people that that skeleton is able to balance all on its own without any other support.
Hmm.
Now, that's not exactly accurate for what we are because we have many more systems and parts than just a skeletal system. But when you show people that that skeleton will balance all on its very own, right on its sit bones, first you show them where the skeleton is balancing on its pelvis, on its sitting bones, and it starts to kind of demystify this idea that sitting takes so much work.
Hmm.
Because really, if we're in balance, it takes some work, but maybe not as much as we think.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think people have an idea that sitting requires a lot more work than in fact it does, and that in turn tends to produce that extra effort.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what else would you say to someone who wants to improve the way in which they sit?
Well, I think where I would go next, Robert, would be to encourage people to explore movement. Uh, and I've come to call these joints our prime movers, kind of riffing on Alexander's theme of primary pattern a little bit. I show people how they can move quite freely from the very top of their spine at what we call the top joints or the planto-occipital joints. So that is the place where our skulls are resting in nice balance on top of our spines, kind of behind our nose, in from our ears.
Hmm.
And that if we kind of have an understanding of movement at that place, so that when we look down or when we look at our computer, if we're letting movement happen quite freely there, and then also finding movement with great ease and flexibility down in our hip joints, which when we're sitting are quite far down, kind of in our lap, if you will. That when we're going to come forward in sitting, maybe we have to reach for something or we have to see something more clearly, that we want to move way down in those hip joints by rocking on those sit bones as opposed to bending at our waist.
Hmm.
That's a very different organization, a very different movement. So I show people where those joints are, and then we kind of explore letting those joints be very available for movement.
So a first step in that is to actually learn on yourself where those joints are. And I'm sure your experience is the same as mine, that most people have absolutely no idea, for example, where their head rests on top of their spine, and where the movement of their head takes place. They typically tend to think it's in the back of their neck or sometimes even on the back of the head itself.
Yes.
So it's a huge revelation to people to learn that, well, as you say, if you were to put your fingers, finger on each side at right angles to the holes of your ears, right
Mm-hmm.
in the middle, that's the top of your spine, and that's where movement takes place. And for most people, that's way far forward and up from where they might imagine. In fact, it's pretty close to eye level, which is a real shock for people.
Okay.
Yeah, it's only about, what, a half an inch or three-quarters of an inch below your eyes. It's very high up.
Yes. And lately I've even been inviting my students to kind of put their tongue at the back of their throat, Robert,
Uh-huh.
because the top joints are also kind of right behind that soft palate.
Oh, so you could. Oh, that's interesting.
It's
Yeah. So
another,
that's
it's,
another way of mapping it on yourself. Yeah.
mhm, exactly.
And I guess another thing we might want to say about where the hip joints are located, most people tend to think their hip joints are somewhere around where their belt is or where their waist is. And again, that's incorrect mapping and leads to inefficient movement because hip joints are considerably lower than that. And it's
Yes.
very, very important to know where you are in relation to a chair and what moves and what doesn't move efficiently. So that seems
Yes.
like really basic information for anyone who wants to learn how to sit well.
Absolutely. And again, using a skeleton is a wonderful tool because you can show people, and I often do, the motion at the hip joints. The femur coming into the pelvis is a very large, sturdy ball and socket joint that's designed both for a great amount of movement in one place
Hmm.
and quite capable of supporting quite a bit of weight.
Hmm.
Whereas if you show them when they bend at their waist that they're using a much smaller joint, yes, that's
Hmm.
not designed for a whole lot of movement in one place. The spine is designed for a whole lot of movement cumulatively throughout the whole span of the spine. But there's no hinge in our spine at our waist. And so putting a lot of movement in one place is not only inefficient, and not quite right with how that spine is designed, but it causes quite a bit of discomfort in people. And when people look at the structure itself, they can see that. They can start to see that. So then, of course, we take the visual information and the idea and we put it right into movement. So we have people kind of feel for their sit bones right underneath their seat,
Hmm.
and we feel how they're rounded kind of knobs, almost like rocking chair rockers.
Hmm.
And you get to direct people to start rocking on their rockers, and they can even put their fingers down and feel where their torso is kind of creasing and folding over their legs deep into their hip sockets. And then they can start to understand that that's using their hip sockets to come forward. And then you have them kind of bend from their waist and see that their pelvis hasn't moved at all. And that's a very different action.
Hmm. Hmm. So, any other suggestions you would have for someone who wants to learn how to sit more easily?
Well, I find that people often strain themselves quite heartily throughout their arms and necks and shoulders when they are sitting. And so there's a couple things they can pay attention to that would help. The first is to kind of understand that for balance and sitting, really at its most basic, we want the weight of our skull balancing over the weight of our pelvis.
Hmm.
That if somehow we've pulled our head forward in space, we're then balancing our head out over what I call the ether or
Hmm.
out over our lap.
Hmm.
And then what we've done is we've put our neck muscles to great effort constantly to hold on for dear life. And so that if we kind of pay attention in a more relational way to where our head is over our support, which would be our pelvis, then our neck starts to have a little bit more of a break and it's not going to pull on our shoulders and arms as much as well.
And that pattern of kind of pushing your head and neck forward in space, is really exacerbated for a lot of people by video display terminals, by computer screens. That there's a kind of a tendency to want to get your eyes a little closer to what you're looking at, and then
Exactly.
that kind of pushing forward of your head and neck. And actually, the amount further forward that you get your eyes is pretty negligible, but it's enough to really kind of destroy the whole balance of your head on top of your spine. In fact, you're not really when you're doing that, your head is no longer in balance. You have to hold it up, and that requires a lot of work. I think it's pretty useful for people to know that their head weighs a lot, maybe 10 to 12 pounds for most people, and if that weight is not nicely balanced on top of your spine, then everything else in your body has to figure out how to compensate for that. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
And it's worth mentioning too, I think, Robert, that if we're going to look at this habit of pulling our heads off balance by reaching forward in order to see something, that they might spend some time looking at where their computer monitor is, and they
Hmm.
might even want to pull it towards them that extra inch or two, or pull their chair in a
Hmm.
little bit
Hmm.
so that they're not asking their neck to make up that focal distance, but they're kind of using all sides of the equation to their best benefit.
Right, right. And while we're on the subject of what I suppose could be called some ergonomic considerations here,
Yes.
there I found, and I got this idea from an Alexander teacher named Galen Krantz, who's a professor of architecture, actually at
Hmm.
University of California in Berkeley, who wrote a wonderful book about 10 years ago called The Chair,
Oh,
in
okay.
which she goes through the whole history of the chair, but she also talks about the advantage of sitting in a chair that's a bit higher than the normal one.
Mm.
And when I first read that, I thought that sounded crazy, but I gave it a try. And honestly, I would never use a chair sitting at a desk anymore. I use a stool, which is
Uh-huh.
about 1.5 times the height of a chair. It's a pretty standard size stool and has no back on it either. And I find that incredibly comfortable. As she points out, that really sitting with your knees a bit lower than your hips
Yes.
encourages the basic natural upward release of your spine just by itself without any
Yes.
Alexander intervention. So what I do with my students is I tell them spend $20 at Target, get a stool,
Mm-hmm.
and just have it available and use it for a while. And if it's uncomfortable, switch back to the chair, but don't force yourself to use it. And I'd say a good 2/3 of my students within a few days have given up their chair and are just using a stool, flat, usually circular.
Mm-hmm.
Mine's wooden stool, and it also has the effect of not only helping your spine release up, but also it enables you to make movements in all directions. If you want to reach over to one side to pick up the phone, it's very easy to do on that kind of a surface. Those sits bones that we've been talking
Mm-hmm.
about don't just allow a rocking forward and back movement, but allow movement to the sides and
Mm-hmm.
wherever you want to go. And then you have little uh, foot rests or bars across on the bottom of the stool, so you have all kinds of options for putting your feet in different positions. So it tends to, in my experience, it tends to encourage mobility, which is probably a pretty good thing for anyone who's sitting for a long time at a desk. So
Yes.
that's my ergonomic tip. And of course, also, you're higher up, you may have to adjust your keyboard and monitor if that's what you're working with. But y- I find it's a little easier looking at a computer screen if I'm looking ever so slightly down on it rather
Mm-hmm.
than looking up on it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's another sort of, I guess we would call that an ergonomic consideration.
Absolutely. And I'll just add briefly another solution and another ergonomic solution along a similar line is I encourage people to buy a wedge pillow
Hmm.
that does the same thing in that it raises the pelvis up so that your pelvis can be higher than your knees. And what's nice about getting a pillow like that is it's quite easy to take with you. So, for
Hmm.
instance, my professional musicians that I see,
Hmm.
especially the taller ones, really have a difficult time when they go and do different, gigs around and the chairs really are not so comfortable for them or fit them very well. And if they have this little cushion with them, they can make whatever chair they encounter fit them a little bit better. So that's also a nice tip.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if you have to sit in a regular chair, especially a chair that's not all that well designed, then that would make a huge difference. I think if you have a stool that's higher than a chair, you probably don't need that wedge because you've already
Exactly.
elevated your hips relative to your knees. Ariel, do you have anything else that you'd like to add to what we've talked about so far?
Well, we could probably talk all day long about
Um,
sitting,
right.
but I think we've hit the major points and just encouraging people both to pay attention to themselves, to allow all their senses to kind of be lively and tuned in,
Hmm.
to kind of educate themselves about their structural support
Hmm.
and kind of all the possibilities for free and flexible movement. I think that's a pretty good start to sitting more comfortably.
I would agree, and I think it might be worth just mentioning that the kinds of things that we've been talking about, which are largely inspired by our experience with the Alexander technique, tend to go against what most postural advice suggests. I mean, typically, if you're reading the paper and someone said, and there's a little article about how to avoid strain sitting, they'll say things like sit up straight or hold your shoulders back or
Mm.
that sort of thing. And unfortunately, that's not just useless advice, but actually pretty much, in my experience anyway, pretty much always bad advice.
And harmful.
Harmful, yeah.
Yes.
It's as harmful as a parent telling their kid to sit up straight, which again is not really a useful thing to do for all kinds of reasons that maybe we don't have time to get into now. But it is kind of sad that most of the advice that people are given for this kind of thing really is not very good. It's not helpful advice. Anyway, enough of that rant. My guest today has been Ariel Weiss, who teaches the Alexander Technique in Philadelphia, and is also, in addition to her private practice, teaches at the Curtis Institute of Music, the University of the Arts, and she's a guest faculty member of the Philadelphia School for the Alexander Technique, which is a training program for Alexander teachers. Ariel, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me, Robert.